The first time I learned my brother had borrowed a fortune against our land, he had already been dead 4 months, and the news came stapled to the gate. A notice of foreclosure sale from a bank 2 counties over for a loan I had never signed, never heard of, never seen a dollar of. My name is Nora. The farm on the notice had been in my family for 3 generations, and the man who mortgaged it out from under me was my own brother Dale, whom I had helped bury in the spring. This is the story of how he spent the last year of his life proving to a bank that half the farm was his to pledge, and how the single word my father wrote 14 years before turned that whole loan, on the morning Dale died, into nothing at all. You have to understand what the farm was. My father, Emmett, was a quiet man who kept 90 acres of orchard and hay ground on a ridge above the valley, land his own father had cleared and nearly lost twice. He kept it through 2 bad decades by refusing to borrow against it, not once, no matter how lean the winter. He used to stand at the top fence line and say the ground did not owe anyone anything, and he meant to keep it that way. My mother, Ruth, died when I was 20. After that, the farm was the only place my father seemed fully alive, walking the rows at first light, and it was the one thing he thought about hardest when he began, near the end, to think about what came after him. I loved my brother, and I want to say that plainly before I say the rest. Dale was the charming one, the one who lit a room, the one who always had a new idea that was going to change everything this time. He was also, my whole life, one deal away from being rich and one deal away from being ruined, and the two were never far apart. He left the farm young for the city and came back between ventures, always between ventures. My father saw all of it clearly. He loved Dale without ever once trusting Dale with money, and when it came time to write down what would happen to the ridge, that clear-eyed love was the thing that saved it. When my father set his affairs in order, he did not simply leave the farm to his 2 children and hope we would work it out. He sat with a lawyer for the better part of a day and chose his words. He deeded the ridge to Dale and to me together, and the deed said we took it as joint tenants with right of survivorship and not as tenants in common. At the time, those sounded like the same lawyerly noise to me, 2 ways of saying the farm was ours. They are not the same. They are almost opposite. And my father, who had watched my brother chase money his entire life, picked the one that would let neither of us sell the other out and would carry the whole ridge someday, to whichever of us was still standing. Here is the difference my brother never respected. If 2 people own land as tenants in common, each owns a separate share they can sell, mortgage, or leave in a will, and when one dies, that share goes to his heirs like any other property. But joint tenants with right of survivorship do not own separate shares at all. They own the whole together as one, and the law watches over one thing above all, that when a joint tenant dies, his interest does not pass to his heirs or his will or his creditors. It simply ends. It vanishes, and the survivor is left owning everything. Not because anything was handed to her, but because there is no longer anyone to share it with. My father did not give us each half a farm. He gave us 1 farm and a rule about who would outlast the other on its title. For years, the arrangement sat quiet. I ran the orchard, Dale sent money some seasons and asked for it in others, and the ridge stayed the ridge. Then his last venture, a restaurant he had poured everything into, began to die the slow way these things die, 1 missed payment at a time. He owed suppliers, he owed a partner, he owed people you do not want to owe. And when a man like Dale runs out of room, he starts to look around at what he can turn into cash. He looked at the 90 acres on the ridge, the only thing either of us owned that a bank would ever call collateral, and he began, quietly, to think of it not as our father's land, but as his half of a solution. He could not sell his interest, not for anything near what he needed. Nobody pays real money for an undivided half of a working farm they cannot occupy or partition without a lawsuit, tied forever to a sister who will not sell. So Dale did the thing that felt clever. He went to a bank in the city, showed them the deed, showed them his name on 90 acres of appreciating ridgeland, and he borrowed against his interest. A large sum, more than I will say here, secured by a mortgage on everything he owned in that farm. He did not tell me. He told the bank that a partition sale could be forced later if it came to that the land could be turned into money, that the collateral was solid. The bank believed him. They wrote him a check, and they wrote a lien onto the ridge, and both of them made the same mistake in the same afternoon. Dale's plan, when I finally pieced it together from his papers, was not complicated. Take the bank's money now to stop the bleeding. Then, when the pressure eased, go to court and ask a judge to partition the farm, to order the ridge sold and the proceeds split, so he could pay the bank and walk away with the rest. It would have meant orchard rows my father planted under an auctioneer's hammer, and it would have meant me fighting my own brother in a courtroom for the ground our mother is buried beside. He was going to make me choose between the farm and a war. I did not know any of it yet. I only knew he had gone quiet that winter, and quiet was never Dale. He never got to file the lawsuit. Dale's heart, which the doctor said had been quietly failing for longer than any of us knew, stopped on a cold morning in March, in a rented apartment in the city, alone. He was 51. Whatever I have said about my brother, and I have tried to be honest, I want to be just as honest about this, that I loved him and I grieved him, and I would undo every clever thing he did if it would give him back one ordinary year. I buried him beside our parents on the ridge he had tried to sell, because that is where he belonged, and because he was still my brother, and because the land was big enough to forgive him even when I was not yet. Then the frost came out of the ground, and 4 months later I found the notice stapled to the gate. The bank moved the way banks move, patiently and without malice, which is somehow worse. Their letter explained it simply. Dale had died, owing them a great deal of money, secured by his interest in the farm. His estate could not pay. So they intended to foreclose on that interest, to take his half of the ridge and force a sale, exactly the sale Dale himself had planned, only now a bank would be the one asking the judge. They spoke of the farm as if it were already half theirs. They had a deed with Dale's name on it, a mortgage he had signed, and a debt nobody disputed. On paper, it looked airtight. There was only one document they had read too quickly, and it was the oldest one in the file. I took my father's deed to a lawyer of my own, an old woman who had done title work in that county for 40 years, and she read it once and set it down and said, "They have a problem." Then she showed me the word. Survivorship. When my father deeded the ridge to Dale and me as joint tenants with right of survivorship, he built into it the rule I told you about, that when one joint tenant dies, his interest is not passed to anyone. Not to his heirs, not to his estate, not to his creditors, and not to his bank. It ends at the moment of death, and the survivor owns the whole. So on that cold morning in March, the instant Dale's heart stopped, his half of the farm did not become part of his estate for the bank to chase. It ceased to exist, and the 90 acres became mine entirely by operation of law before the bank had even heard he was gone. But he signed a mortgage, the bank said, and a mortgage attaches to the land. Here is where the second half of my father's choice did its work. In this state, a mortgage is not a sale. It does not hand the bank any piece of the title. It is only a lien, a security interest, a string tied to whatever the borrower owns, and if what he owns disappears, the string is tied to nothing. Dale's mortgage attached to Dale's joint tenancy interest and to nothing else. It did not, could not, reach my share, because we did not have separate shares. And critically, a mere lien did not sever the joint tenancy, did not quietly turn us into tenants in common behind my back, because a lien is not a conveyance and severing takes a conveyance. So the tenancy held whole all the way to the morning Dale died, and when his interest vanished, the lien that was tied to it vanished in the same instant. The bank was left holding a mortgage on a thing that no longer existed. The bank's lawyers were not fools, and they tried the only door left to them. They argued that the mortgage itself had severed the joint tenancy, that the moment Dale pledged his interest, he had broken the deed apart into 2 separate shares, so that his half survived his death as ordinary property they could seize. It is a clever argument, and it has been made many times, and in this state it fails for one clean reason. Severing a joint tenancy requires an act that transfers title, a sale, a real conveyance, something that actually moves ownership from one hand to another. A mortgage in a lien state moves nothing. It only promises. My father's deed had never been broken because a promise is not a transfer, and the judge said as much in a single dry paragraph that I have read more times than I can count. The mortgage did not sever. Survivorship stood. The foreclosure had nothing left to foreclose. The bank withdrew the sale. There was no half of the farm to take, no lien to enforce, no debtor left alive to owe. They had lent a fortune against a signature that the law quietly emptied on the morning the signer died, and there was no one to blame for it but the afternoon they wrote the check without reading the oldest page in the folder. I do not feel triumphant about it, not really. The bank lost money it never should have lent. My brother lost his life before his cleverness could ruin mine. But the ridge my grandfather cleared and my father refused to borrow again stayed whole and unmortgaged and mine, exactly as the deed intended, and one gray afternoon I walked down the lane and pulled the notice off the gate myself. I think about my father almost every day now, in the office where he chose those words. He could not stop Dale from being who Dale was. He could not make my brother careful, or patient, or content, and he was too honest to try. What he could do was write one sentence that would hold no matter what Dale did, a sentence that let my brother spend the whole of himself and still never take the ridge from me. 2 names on one title and 1 survivor. You cannot lend against the half the grave will take back. That was my father's rule, and he trusted it to outlast the both of us, and it did. Dale is buried on the land he tried to sell, and I water the orchard over him every summer, and the ground, just as our father always said, does not owe anyone anything. So here's my question for you. A bank lent my brother a fortune against a farm, and a single word in a 14-year-old deed made that fortune vanish the day he died. Who really lost this one? The brother who mortgaged what death would erase? The bank that never read the deed? Or my father who saw the whole thing coming and answered it with 1 word before he was gone? Tell me in the comments. If you want the next one, a man who sold the same 5 acres to 2 different buyers and learned too late which one the county clock actually protected, subscribe, and I will tell you how that one ended too. These are the Vendetta Tapes. Nobody here breaks the law. They just finally read it.